Dark Souls, the seminal game of the 7th generation by popular consensus. A lot has been said about it over the years, but often the greater context surrounding it is neglected, seemingly to elevate the game's legendary status. And by greater context, I'm not just talking about how it picks up the ball from Demon's Souls, though that is important, but that From Software had released 10 out of 10 games long before Miyazaki started working there. And Dark Souls is not some abnormality in their lineup. It's an incredibly straightforward adaptation of where the original Kingsfield trilogy left off. If Kingsfield 4 was the pure distillation of Kingsfield 1's console-locked dungeon-crawling ambition, then Dark Souls is the realization of Kingsfield 2's more open and interconnected dungeon crawler. Having done a deep dive into From Software's pre-Miyazaki library, I have an expanded appreciation of their games, and to make this video stand out a bit in the admittedly crowded Dark Souls analysis marketplace, I'm going to lean into the legacy which predates Dark Souls, to explain where that expanded appreciation is coming from. Because of this, I'd recommend that if you feel your grounding in Kingsfield and Demon's Souls is shaky, that you watch my videos on those games before going any further here. Many different events have coincided to make this video happen, chief among them being the publication of the Abyssal Archive, in my opinion, the most comprehensive Dark Souls lore project ever assembled, featuring in-depth analyses and detailed comparisons between the original Japanese script and the English one. It was put together by channel friend Lokey, and I couldn't be happier to promote it. Lokey has always been the most detailed lore hunter in the community, and the work put into the 2-volume project is nothing short of amazing. To fetch your copy, go to www.abyssalarchive.com. For a better sense of the book's contents, subscribe on the bottom of the campaign page to receive an email with sample chapters. There's also a pre-order campaign for a limited edition which will run until August 14th. If that excites you, act quickly. Support for the Abyssal Archive will help fund future projects like it, including an audiobook version to be narrated by VaatiVidya. Once more, check this project out at abyssalarchive.com. Lokey also worked with me to put together a lore breakdown for Gwyn, and in addition to my Kingsfield and Demon's Souls videos, I'd recommend that you check that video out before watching further here, because I'll be drawing on its content heavily going forwards. Hi, I'm AesirAesthetics, and in this video, I'll be exploring Dark Souls as the next step from Demon's Souls and Kingsfield, and I'll be looking at its attempt to prop up the narrative which Lokey's retranslation shone a new light on. Assuming you've watched the previously noted videos, or if you don't want to because taking suggestions is for nerds, there's nothing left to do but to grab yourself a cup of coffee as we take a look back at Dark Souls. Having failed to capitalize on a great thing at the time, Sony missed out on riding the From Soft wave from the top. Of course, Demon's Souls would not be their last cooperation. From Software is still contracted to develop a few more PlayStation games as of the writing of this video, but the winner of Demon's Souls was clearly not Sony, but FromSoft. Having a cult masterpiece under their belt, they were able to secure an eager partner in Namco Bandai, which picked up the distribution rights for Demon's Souls in PAL regions after Sony passed on it. They wanted Miyazaki and the team to make lightning strike again. Demon's Souls started development when Sony reached out to FromSoft and commissioned them to make an Oblivion clone. That project went into a death spiral internally until Miyazaki stepped up to the plate and took it over, readjusting it to be a marriage of From Software's previous games like Kingsfield and games he admired like Fumito Ueda's Ico. Dark Souls began development as the next step from what was delivered in Demon's Souls, so the team had a lot of the groundwork ready for them. But not content to do Demon's Souls 2 by another name, they actually shook things up. Dark Souls took 2 years to make, and one of the chief aims was for the world to feel more real. But since it was iterating on Demon's Souls, most of what is on display is actually the results of retuning that game's mechanics to deliver the new direction, rather than creating new ones from the ground up. I noted this when I was talking about Kingsfield, but Dark Souls expands on Demon's Souls, almost exactly like how Kingsfield 2 expanded on Kingsfield 1. Both successors ditched linear dungeon crawling for a more open sequenced and interconnected world, and irrespective of quality, both successors blow out their predecessors' conceptual scope. The development's day-to-day creative process was guided by Hidetaka Miyazaki, who, to capitalize on the talents of his staff, commissioned the emotions of designs rather than specifics. For example, the direction he gave to the artists when they were creating weapons and armors was to make something they would trust their lives with in battle, or to make something with a protective enchantment. And with these basic and ambiguous directions, the artists were able to make stuff which far exceeded Miyazaki's imagination. That's not to say there was no order, however. When he got a design he didn't like, Miyazaki would give out more specific instructions, though he made a conscious effort to not make his team of artists into tools by telling them this color or this shape. Miyazaki feels that once instructions are too specific, creativity goes somewhat out of the window, and how he knew where to draw the line was because he had a guiding principle for what he wanted from designs. The guiding principle of the artistry of the game was that it needed to be refined, elegant, and dignified. And while Miyazaki actually left the nuts and bolts of artistry to the artists, when these principles were not served, he would readjust the mindset of the designs to get something which more closely fit the game. The initial design of the undead dragon, for example, was supposedly disgusting, being covered in maggots, and guiding the redesign was Miyazaki's suggestion that, instead of focusing on the undead part, the artist should hone in on the sadness of a great creature marching on towards its own extinction. Dark Souls draws on other works of fantasy, dark and high, like Berserk and Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Kingsfield, Demon Souls, the fighting fantasy role-playing books, as well as other assorted RPGs and mythologies. And it was a creative decision by Miyazaki that the team should go out of their way to resist the easy route. It's true that they were making a fantasy game, but he welcomed curveballs and experimentations as those would be unpredictable and would make the game stand out in its genre. Thematically, Miyazaki wanted three things: gods and knights, centered on Anor Londo, demons and chaos, centered on Lost Izalith, and death and decay, centered on Nito. And a final main theme cropped up at some point in the ancient and uniform world of the dragons. As more and more designs piled in, more specific requests could be made of the artists, as it was clearer where each new element would fit into the larger whole, and the artists themselves often had long discussions with Miyazaki about philosophy and the roles of characters and themes, which expanded on the meaning of certain elements in the game, and this process helped to ensure that the world felt realized. Visually, Dark Souls is a very impressive and uniquely looking game, so this laid-back attitude to direction seems to have paid off, and why wouldn't it? Allowing each cog in the machine the maximum freedom to deliver on their craft seems like an easy path to getting something unique. That's how it was for Miyazaki when he rescued Demon Souls, after all. Dark Souls' story is a melancholy exhibition of misery, and the horrors which emerge when the natural law of the world gets perverted. Presentation-wise, it is famously minimalistic, and it utilizes RPG design conventions for narrative, rather than more explicit or straightforward techniques. That is, RPGs have item descriptions, Dark Souls' item descriptions are utilized for lore. RPGs have environments, Dark Souls are utilized for environmental storytelling. The game does, of course, employ more traditional techniques like cutscenes and dialogues, but because of how desolate the world is, the player will find themselves leaning on those unorthodox methods to more flesh out the landscape. Having experimented extensively with this presentation technique in Demon Souls allowed Miyazaki to lean more into them here, since there was a readier understanding of what worked and what didn't. Like in that game, Dark Souls opens on a cutscene which set the groundwork for its story. Long ago, the world was uniform and ruled over by dragons. Then fire came, and with it, disparity. Light and dark, hot and cold, life and death. And souls of dispersed power, 4 of which stood atop all others and were held by those who would become the great lords of the souls. They are the first leaders in history, and eventually, after creating their own civilizations, they warred with the dragons, and after winning out, they had the world for themselves. This ushered in the Age of Fire. Eventually, however, this fire began to fade, and humans began to rise in power. To combat this, Gwyn immolated himself to prolong his age after setting up methods to keep it alive forever. The game's story picks up near the end of this second wave of the Age of Fire, and humans are afflicted with the curse of undeath. They resurrect after dying until they eventually lose their minds and go hollow in a process known as hollowing, which ludonarratively can be thought of as the player giving up. There's actually a real depth to how much of the player experience is contextualized in-world, which is something I'm always a fan of. I like it when fast travel is contextualized as the player taking a carriage between towns, or when role-playing games have optional varied faction quests which help propel the player through a specific build of their choice. If that's the baseline of action RPGs conceptualizing gameplay conveniences, then a game like Morrowind would be a very good comparison case to Dark Souls, and in that comparison, one can't help noticing that Dark Souls' contextualizations of play are often layered incredibly deep within its own lore. So much so, in fact, that players kinda need to take the game on its word that these things actually connect to the same game as the story we see in the opening cutscene. Things like the rite of kindling, respawning at bonfires, and collecting the souls of fallen enemies all feel like they were game mechanics first, later incorporated into the lore, but because the law of this universe is so far from our own, it actually never feels like the in-game context of these mechanics is being shoehorned in. If you want to poke holes in the game's presentation, surely you would start by talking about the kilometer-tall trees or the elephant-sized crows. Dark Souls knows it's a fantasy game, so it doesn't feel the need to be ashamed of its gamey components. It flaunts them. And the excellent blurring of the lines between conventional fantasy and Dark Souls often has a culprit in the game mechanics which make it what it is. Much like Demon Souls before it, Dark Souls is a third-person action RPG, and it focuses largely on exploration and defeating bosses as a means of propelling the player forwards. Most of the gameplay is brought one-to-one back from Demon Souls, but touches here and there are new, with some even harkening back to pre-Miyazaki from Software. Like how the small radius of light, which is here to make dark areas playable, is basically the same as it was in Shadow Tower. And like in Shadow Tower and Kingsfield, standard enemies here hit really hard, so death is always close by, which will make players go through the world cautiously, keeping their eyes open for alternate paths and possible traps. The world is mostly a continuous and interconnected affair with some choke points and warp points here and there for story and loading purposes. Around the halfway mark, the player gains the ability to warp between checkpoints, and areas become more linear and self-contained. But some groundwork first. The opening area is usually the best place to start when evaluating games, as they are often designed last, once the developers have gotten a perfect idea of what sort of experience they are trying to prime the player for. This was the case for the Undead Asylum, and with it, Miyazaki wanted to capture a cold and dark atmosphere in an environment mainly consisting of stone architecture. The Undead Asylum was created to be a condensed version of the game, and tutorial-wise, it's worth noting that every major change from Demon Souls which could be introduced so early on was. The less restricted rolling paths, the bonfire checkpoints, the Estus flasks and plunge attacks, just to name a few. Dark Souls was not designed to be inaccessible to non-Demon Souls alumni, but these sorts of touches makes me think FromSoft paid attention to the fact that a part of their player base would already have a certain expectation going in, and that they took steps to redirect those early on, which gets a gold star from me. In the Undead Asylum, 2 of the game's 5 objectives are given to the player. The first is simply to escape, but on their way to do so, players encounter Oscar, fatally wounded, who urges the player to fulfill an ancient prophecy from his homeland, to ring the Bell of Awakening, and to uncover the fate of the undead. Finding this Bell of Awakening, actually bells, but hell if Oscar knew that, is the biggest goal of the first third or so of the game, and this part of the game highlights eminently another change from Demon Souls, which is the lack of warping between areas, at least in the early game. After the Crow delivers the chosen undead to their main hub, Firelink Shrine, another change from Demon Souls makes itself apparent. That game's hub was the Nexus, which contained dependable guides in the Archstones, which all warped the player back to the levels. These sorts of guides are nowhere to be seen in Firelink Shrine, and so the player comes to grapple with 3 ideas. 1, they will get lost in the world, because 2, navigation in this world is not as newcomer-friendly as it was in Demon Souls, and 3, the idea of a hub is a more transient concept this time around. Firelink Shrine was one of the first areas created, and it began as a sort of water temple area. The reasoning there was that since it was the player's hub, it should be a place of healing, so water, soft light, greenery, and subtle music should all be integrated in it. Without the Master Key, Firelink Shrine branches off to 3 paths, and, to a first-time player, 2 are worth going. The most obvious path, Undeadburg, is their best place to go, but the ability to make the call to descend the catacombs, which will net them the ability to superkindle bonfires, is an early indicator of a devotion to something I like to call the getting lost in the world mood. I find that my favorite moments in games usually come about organically after I've been allowed to be alone with a game for an extended period of time, and Dark Souls is a title that really capitalizes on this. No bloated cutscenes and no unfunny sidekick yammering his characterization at me. This game is a more pure experience, in a sense. And a lot of sneaky tricks are employed for direction here. But before I can elaborate on those, a brief side note. Every inclusion both adds and subtracts from a work. It adds with the ramifications of its inclusion, but it also means you've limited the things you can do onwards. Every word in a poem limits what you can write after it. Every scene in a movie likewise narrows the expressive opportunities for all subsequent scenes. And for video games, which are by their nature more open-ended, this means that an alternate path both creates freedom in that you're not railroaded through a specific gauntlet, but it also means the director's ability to guide the experience is limited. Much of this video will be discussing how Dark Souls changed the formula from Demon Souls to prop up a different sort of experience, so this idea is good to have in memory going forwards. We can think of it as a sort of commitment consequential constraint principle. The CCC. We can think of it as a sort of knock-on effect. To maintain a game's identity, to ensure that players don't accidentally play something they weren't supposed to, the go-to maneuver is to have an ever-present director orbiting the player, and this is of course the gameplay loop. Whatever direction the player chooses from Firelink Shrine, they'll be fighting hard-hitting enemies while juggling ever-decreasing health and healing resources. Additionally, every enemy slain will drop souls, the game's merchant and leveling currency. This sets up a tension cycle, with players getting more tense as they delve deeper into the world, until they find a bonfire which resets their healing items and allows them to allocate their souls, making further progress a less liable endeavor, which releases the tension and starts the cycle over again. And this gameplay loop is Dark Souls. It ensures the same core experience in between every checkpoint, and that experience is one of overcoming hardships and feeling relief at the sight of bonfires. Simple, elegant, and versatile. This structure is as fitting walking through a town of insane soldiers as it is traversing an infested sewer system, a flooded city, skeleton-infested underground graveyard, and magical forest. Each location alters the flavor of the gameplay loop a bit, but the core components mostly transfer over throughout the entire game. Combat is a significant part of the gameplay loop, and this area is massively expanded on from Demon's Souls. More weapons, more weapon types, and better enemy AI make for a more robust combat experience. It's not the deepest thing in the world, but considering its job is to elicit dread and give the player a sense of accomplishment from achieving victory, it's a very successful implementation. And when I say it's not that deep, I mean not deep in the sense deep combat systems are usually defined. This isn't Devil May Cry. In fact, the combat is so simple that the weapon's damage outputs are the exact same as they were in Kingsfield Freaking 1, which was one of the very first games released on the original PlayStation back in 1994. And if you've ever wondered about the why of the backstab-heavy combat, Demon's Souls originally began as a first-person Oblivion clone, and From Software's previous first-person games combat was super backstab-heavy as well. Not because it dealt more damage, but because enemies generally could not pose a threat if you stayed behind them. And once Demon's Souls' camera was moved to be exclusively third-person, much of the enemy AI was maintained, enough for that game to actually be playable in first-person. You'd have to fiddle around with the code to enable that, but in practice it still mostly functions. To make third-person action viable with the first-person combat they had created, FromSoft needed to add a lock-on mechanic, and once they had done that, it made sense for backstabs to have a special animation. So, few games of iteration transformed this into this. It's actually kinda incredible that the combat isn't a disaster, considering what it's drawing from and how it came about. And this really is a good case for simplicity. And that it is simple doesn't mean that there is no depth. Like I said earlier, it's just not depth as deep game combat is usually defined. The combat here is deep in the exact same way climbing was a deep mechanic in Shadow of the Colossus. Both are monstrously meat and potatoes simple, but the fine-tuning of surrounding stakes elevates both into massively engrossing. These systems are not deep, but they get you deeply engaged. A point I bring up from time to time, usually when I talk about save points, is that one can prop up a quote-unquote boring experience by simply amping up the stakes of the minute-to-minute gameplay. Walking from A to B is more engaging when there are monsters in the way. More engaging still when dying to them sets the player back 5 minutes, more engaging still when it's 10 minutes. Uncemented progress. Progress the player hasn't made, but which is still in flux as they aren't able to save, or in the case of Dark Souls, level up at bonfires, is something games don't capitalize on for engagement much outside of the horror genre and platformers, I guess. And it's a shame, because stakes are often enough to make simplistic gameplay and mechanics really engaging. Take movement. Movement is very, again, meat and potatoes. You move in the direction you point. And the camera goes where you point it. The nicest thing to say about it is that since movement is locked to the angle the camera points at, it is nice that areas which require fine motor skills, like the rafters in Anor Londo, are considerate enough to let the camera move through walls just to ensure that the player's angle of action isn't arbitrarily disturbed when the camera is snagged on geometry. Very little of the mandatory gameplay is going for style points. It's all simple because it's all in service of that smart gameplay loop. Dark Souls does not need complicated combat, it needs punishing combat. The stakes will take care of the engagement. Same goes for the movement scheme, same goes for leveling up. Leveling up is very straightforward in Dark Souls. In gameplay terms, dexterity and strength are sort of interchangeable damage output scalars for physical weapons, and faith and intelligence both open up miracles and sorceries which are locked behind level walls. The weapons you go with will go much further to distinguishing the experience than the levels you upgrade, something from software's subsequent IPs seem to acknowledge, and the leveling up in Dark Souls is actually kinda idiot-proof. The most important stat to pay attention to is damage reduction, and that number goes up with every level. So as long as the player dumps their levels into something, their build will probably be viable. Not optimal necessarily, but viable. Because the weapon and armor upgrades are what really scale up the player character. Upgrading these is also kind of idiot-proof, and they have a much bigger impact on the player's damage output and absorption than levels do. Interestingly, even though From Software's subsequent games lean more on weapon choices to vary builds, they haven't done away with levels outright as of the writing of this video, and I think this is because levels go so far to closing the gameplay loop. They are the reason players even care to collect souls, and without them the relief of finding bonfires would go down drastically. Also, character upgrades in video games have historically proven themselves to be a good way to keep the player's attention. So, although the leveling up in Dark Souls isn't exactly an all-time impressive feat of coding, like the combat, like the movement, like the camera, and all the other elements we've discussed so far, its contribution to the game is irreplaceable. The image of many people together at a bonfire was there at the beginning, and Miyazaki has gone on record stating that these things were his proudest new inclusion moving from Demon Souls, serving as healing stations, respawn points, and a place for players to communicate emotionally with other players. Something interesting though, which he didn't elaborate on, is that these things free the player from a dependency on any single hub. Bonfires allow the player to attune their magics without talking to vendors like in Demon Souls. They allow them to level up without warping to talk to the level lady. And they also, after the player purchases the right items, makes them somewhat independent of the blacksmiths who repair and upgrade their equipment. Since the player is so independent of the main hub this time around, the level designers were able to take them quite a ways away from Firelink Shrine, creating more opportunities for players to get lost in the world. Something great about the old Kingsfield games was that you didn't start with a map. That meant that you really needed to learn your surroundings or else risk getting lost. And that experience of exploring without a map was brought back to Demon Souls, except that game launched after games had gotten visually distinct enough that the player no longer needed a map to compartmentalize the world. Rooms in Kingsfield often looked the same, which made maps sort of a necessity so that the player didn't get lost. And not that good kind of lost, where you are an independent agent in the world and are uncovering its mysteries. Lost as in everything looks the same and you don't know where to go. But because Demon Souls was visually distinct enough that the areas never bled into one another, the map could be done away with altogether, and the early exploration options from Kingsfield could be made the whole experience in that game. And Dark Souls is a lateral step up from Demon Souls in this regard, since the bonfires allow for the player to get hours of uninterrupted playtime, until about the halfway point when warping becomes an option, but I'll talk more about that in a bit. The world design is very cohesive here, which makes it so much more fantastical. The way Dark Souls builds tension, what with the whole losing one's souls on death, is conceptually not a new mechanic, because this was also done in Demon Souls, but also because really, this is just an updated version of manual save points. Yes, it's that time of the video where I talk about how much I love gimmicky save mechanics, and the similarities Dark Souls has with the old manual save points is that on death, the player loses their progress and has to start over from the last checkpoint. Except there's a bit of additional decision making here, because in this game, the player is given one chance to recover all lost souls, which incidentally is another way tension is maintained. An interesting thing about this mechanic is that it gives death a presence after the fact. When you died in the old Resident Evils or Silent Hills or Kingsfield, that was that, but the Souls games have this added stress of letting the player recover. Dark Souls has an autosave mechanic which is triggered whenever the player dies, whenever they kill an enemy, whenever certain areas are reached, and whenever they leave the game. If you make an NPC hostile, you can't reliably load your way out of that decision, you need to be pardoned. Dark Souls arguably has one of the most aggressive autosaves of any role-playing game when you consider the ramification it has on play, but it also has the distinction of carrying the torch gameplay-wise from the most aggressive manual save point games. Dark Souls marries both approaches to saving progress and gives us the best of both worlds. Bonfires reset the tension cycle, and in addition to being where the player can better attune their magic for the area ahead, where they can make tune-ups to their gear and upgrade their stats, the bonfires also refill the player's health and their healing items. In my Demon Souls video, I cut a bit of flack for preferring that game's Moongrass Healing to Dark Souls' Estus, and this seems like a good time to rustle some feathers again. In for a penny, in for a pound, right? Because, surprise, my opinion hasn't really shifted. I think Demon Souls' ceiling is much higher than Dark Souls', but it comes with the territory. Dark Souls is more limited in the kind of healing it can have, because the healing items can no longer be made dependent on merchants without those merchants appearing near every bonfire. There is simply no way to make the Moongrass healing system one-to-one elegant in a game as open-ended and as devoted to making the player lose themselves geographically in the world as Dark Souls is, so the Estus system was how they fixed healing. It means the developers don't need to fill areas with healing grass, and it also meant that they didn't need to have enemy types in all areas drop healing items, which would have been necessary had the Moongrass system been reused, considering the player will always have a harder time getting back to their central hub to talk to vendors here than they did in Demon Souls. And Estus is a very elegant system for this game, so much so in fact that it's been the baseline of FromSoft's games ever since. This is written before any Elden Ring gameplay has been shown, so don't come at me 3 years down the track. Now, Estus resetting to 5 once the player rests at a bonfire, or more if they burn humanity to kindle those bonfires, means that the connecting path between each bonfire is easier for designers to balance. You playtest each map until you think a player would have used up 5 Estus flasks, and then you put the bonfire down, a little further away, just to make things a bit more tense. This maps a fitting challenge level to each area, which scales with the player's levels, since later bonfire placements are going to be allocated with higher level players in mind. So in the light of all of this elegance, how can one possibly prefer Moongrass Healing, do you ask? Have you, dear viewer, been watching a video made by some pleb this whole time? Nah. While I think Estus is more refined than Moongrass Healing was, it does carry with it some issues I have hang-ups about. First off, it's free. There is no investment on the player's side when they consume it, other than the consideration that they might not have enough to find the next bonfire, in which case they might opt to go back to the previous one, cash in their souls, and try the path again, with all of the enemies respawned. Conceptually, Moongrass did not work this way. It was a resource which existed in the world in a finite amount, and if you wanted more, you had to buy it. So halfway through a level with depleted resources, going back was not as easy a choice to make because you've already invested a certain amount of resources into the first attempt. And when you died in Demon Souls, you not only had to stress about getting your souls back, you had to do so with fewer resources at your disposal. Once both resources are stress tested, I find Moongrass to be much crueler than Estus. Of course, there are some players who just stocked up on 99 of every grass and had an easy time. I got a lot of those comments the last time I talked about this, but this is why I preempted the discussion with the word conceptually. Conceptually, I think Demon's Souls' investment-based healing system is better because when put to the test, it can deliver latria. Moments when you decide to forge ahead broke because you've already invested too many healing resources into the attempt at hand to start the attempt over. Estus and its derivatives probably can't do that without some other overhauls, because the option of going back and casting in your souls has no downsides other than having to redo the level. But I'm not going to pretend that saying conceptually gets me off the hook here. While the majority of players did not stock up on 99 healing items in Demon's Souls on their first run, the ability to do that speaks to that game's inability to fully deliver on what was conceptually promised. For 99% of first-time players, Demon's Souls' willingness to let the players screw themselves will land. Whether that high is recaptured in subsequent playthroughs largely depends on the player mastering the game. But there is almost certainly going to be a point where Demon's Souls' healing becomes more of an annoyance. It comes after some time, but it does come. When it came to healing, Demon's Souls was more content than Dark Souls is to let the player despair. Dark Souls sacrificed the cruelty to deliver on the world design, and make no mistake, when it comes to traversal, Dark Souls is a league above Demon's Souls. But, going back to what I said earlier about knock-on effects, the decision to have Dark Souls be interconnected means it needed to have more player-friendly healing. Letting the player be lost in the world means you need to scale back the cruelty because they can't simply go somewhere else at any moment. Now, of course, I'm not going to ignore the fact that Dark Souls at times is incredibly cruel with its traversal. The best example I can think of is being cursed, but those are the exceptions. Every flavor detracts from the others. Every change amps up the impact of the experience in one area and detracts from it in another, either actually or conceptually. Thankfully, however, both games are incredibly well-realized versions of themselves, so one doesn't need to pick. They complement each other, so one can like both equally. But Demon's Souls is better, though. From Software's transient online system was inspired by an occurrence where Miyazaki was driving to work one day and got stuck in traffic gridlock due to the snow. People organically began to push the furthest car to allow movement to return, and after a few turns of this, Miyazaki was pushed. He wondered whether he would have been friends with the people who helped him, and this idea of mutual assistance inspired the online in Demon's Souls. The online system, like the healing system was, in Dark Souls is a re-adaptation of Demon's Souls' multiplayer to fit the new approach to world design. Once again, stretched to their limits, Demon's Souls was crueler than Dark Souls, since offline play required the player to play the game with reduced max health, or to disconnect from the internet. But in terms of invasions and summons, Dark Souls' covenants go a long way to iron out the kinks from Demon's Souls, while also expanding on the lore ramifications of online play. Covenants are factions in-game which all serve specific purposes, which means they all guide the online experience into something more structured, varied, and dependable than what we saw in Demon's Souls. I've seen it suggested in the community that subsequent Dark Souls games should lean more on covenants for narrative purposes, and I can definitely see the appeal in this. They are non-intrusive ways for the game to create highly directed experiences which feel organic, without breaking the core gameplay loop. Going back to the analogy of gameplay loop as orbiting director, one which constantly hovers around the player, guiding them with choice and lack of choice, it might be constructive to think of the covenants as additional directors. One summons the player to Darkroot Forest, one incentivizes the player to help other players fight bosses, etc. And although they aren't as fully fleshed out or have as deep a sense of permanence as many players would want, I think it's undeniable that as is, their presence really helps make the online experience bring more life into the world. The mechanics governing online play have been streamlined significantly from Demon's Souls, and it has also been tied much closer to the game's lore than it was back then. Governing online play in Dark Souls is humanity. This mechanic is integrated into the bonfire gameplay loop. To access online play, the players must be in human form. To do this, they must reverse hollowing by burning up one humanity at a bonfire. Additionally, to kindle bonfires, they must also first be in human form. Death starts the process of hollowing again and makes the player lose all held humanity in the exact same way they lose their souls, and these can be recovered the exact same way. In world, the humanities can be acquired by buying them, stealing them, looting them from dead enemies, or just finding them lying around. Reversing hollowing opens up the multiplayer and gives the player access to summons and makes them susceptible to invasions. All things considered, I think the online here is a step up from Demon Souls in every way, with the exception that it doesn't cut into health. A change reversed in both subsequent Dark Souls games, which makes me think I'm not the only one who felt this way. When comparing Dark Souls to Demon Souls, one cannot help but favor separated elements of each game over the same element in the other. But this should not be done without paying attention to why these changes were made. Moongrass Healing would drag down the experience Dark Souls wants to present. The more robust online system congeals much better to the type of game this is. Under immense scrutiny, individual aspects of the game might at points prove to be underwhelming, but Dark Souls is a package. Just like how Demon Souls was an attempt at eco-fying the old From Software dungeon crawlers, Dark Souls is an attempt at open-worldifying Demon Souls, and the new mechanics and changes to design are all in service of that goal, while preserving that Demon Souls experience of overcoming obstacles and feeling relief and accomplishment when the next safe area is in sight. After ringing both bells of awakening, Frompt appears and gives the player their new heading, which is to get the Lord Vessel. This means traversing through Sen's fortress of traps and salty gamers to reach An Orlando, where the vessel is kept. And it may be a strange place to actually talk about the world, because for me at least, this is kinda where Dark Souls starts to run out of steam. Dark Souls has universally beloved level design, and I actually think this passion has more to do with the presentation than the levels themselves. And I say this because From Software has outdone the complexity and creativity on display here in subsequent games, but those never got the level design love to the same extent. While I think the level design here is great, I think what people loved was the expansiveness of the world and the mood of getting lost in it. Each area was designed with a specific emotion in mind. Blighttown was supposed to emanate a sadness and a bitter cold, and it exists in the same world as An Orlando, which emanates a false grandeur, and neither drags down the other. Quite the contrary. The range of expression in areas increases dramatically the scale of the world, which made getting lost in it more impactful. Subsequent From games have never executed on these aspects quite as well, I think, and it might have to do with structure more than scope. I noted earlier that I was gonna expand on warping. Here goes. When fast travel is accessible from the get-go, the player can mentally break the game world up into chunks, since they don't really need to understand how it connects in a sensical way. Warping from the get-go removes the need for shortcuts, which loop back to previous areas, a necessity when you're walking everywhere like you are in the first half of this game, and the ramifications this has on design is that the world doesn't need to be all that cohesive. It doesn't need to constantly loop back into itself with fun and believable shortcuts. The level layout in this game on a macro scale is intricate chambers like Undeadburg or Sen's Fortress, which are all connected with tunnels, bridges, ladders, and cliffs to other such chambers. These in-between chamber areas can be thought of as the world's connective tissue, and examples include the Valley of Drakes, Darkroot Basin, the Great Hollow, the path from Undead Parish to Darkroot Garden, the long ladder down to Lower Undeadburg, the cliffs in the Tomb of the Giants, the tower connecting Quelaag's boss room to the Demon Ruins, the long elevators in Anor Londo, and the cliff in the Demon Ruins you fight Kirk on, just to name a few. And these connective tissues are generally my favorite places, as they're the ones where the lost in the world mood is most often felt. People's affinities for post-Demon Souls FromSoft games scales shockingly close to how much the player is able to rearrange the level chunks to control their own experience and more nimbly construct their own builds. And as it stands, Dark Souls 1 seems to be the sweet spot. It's got an open-ended path from the beginning up until you get the Lord Vessel, which is when the mandatory chunks are made open for the player to rearrange as they warp to where they want to go. And in the mandatory beginning levels, there was such a plethora of optional areas and things to do, some even linking back to the mandatory endgame gauntlets, that it could have been considered a satisfying structure in its own right. Whether or not you take sides and prefer the early half or the latter half of this game is probably dependent on whether you take sides in having your experience be about building your character or navigating the world, with people who prefer the early game liking exploration and the people who like build variety probably preferring the latter half. Exceptions here and there, of course, but I'd bet this is a pretty good approximation. I'm firmly in Team Exploration, and coming from Demon Souls, whose levels were way more linearly constructed, Dark Souls sort of peaks for me, with the Iron Golem. Once we reach Anor Londo, the interconnectedness of the levels is mostly disbanded in favor of more focused gauntlets, and the reason I just brought up Demon Souls is because a one-to-one comparison of the more open progression linear levels of the late game here mirrors the setup from that game. There, the Nexus hub area connected to 5 gauntlets, which the player could tackle in any order, and all of these gauntlets were a linear track between checkpoints which the player could warp between. In Dark Souls, after getting the Lord Vessel, we also have 5 gauntlets to run. That is the Duke's Archives culminating in Seath, Lost Isolith with the Bed of Chaos, Tomb of the Giants with Nito, New Londo with the 4 Kings, most players at least will tackle New Londo in the late game, and Ulasil, culminating in Manus. Now this is admittedly an optional area, but it's scaled to the late game, and genuinely does a lot to prop it up, so most players will always go there, which is why I'm including it. And these areas are also, for the most part, linear gauntlets, choked out by checkpoints, which the player can warp between. This setup worked really well for Demon Souls, but in Dark Souls, it feels comparatively underwhelming. Much has been said about how late-game areas were clearly unrealized as the team needed to cut corners to meet deadlines, but, courting controversy again, I actually don't think compared to the early game, lackluster late game can be solely laying at the feet of time restraints, because Ulasil, generally considered the best late game area since it got a production schedule all to itself, I don't think hits on that early game high either. It's good, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't recapture the magic of the first half of the game because it's only playable post fast travel. And because it isn't integrated into the larger world as an alternate path which loops back into the main game in interesting ways, it's a self-contained area. This all goes back to what I said earlier about the gameplay loop. At its core, Dark Souls seems to be designed around getting lost in the interconnected world. Taking a random path will often lead you back to an earlier area and leave you scratching your head as to whether or not the developers cheated the world geometry. Spoiler alert, for the most part, they didn't. When you don't have the fast travel, you will have to map out the world in your head when you decide to go from B back to A, and you will get lost. If you ever got lost in Demon Souls, you just needed to die, and then you would immediately have access to a warp back to the Nexus again. So, the latter half of Dark Souls falling a bit flat compared to the early game is to be expected, because the gameplay was clearly tuned to the interconnected world you got lost in, and it's now being asked to prop up more linear dungeon crawling. It's still strong enough to get the job done, it just loses some of its oomph. But I don't want to kick the game. I can see where the developers were coming from. The larger the game becomes, the more of a hassle it is to get from A to B, both in terms of mapping out in your mind where things are in relation to each other, but also in terms of execution. For those magical first few hours, this is gold. But as the world is unfurled more and more, you not only get diminishing returns, but you also get some blowback. The larger the map becomes, the more tedious it is to traverse it manually. The world might simply have been about to cave in on itself, so to provide some distance between areas and to allow each late game area to inhabit its own self-contained biome without it feeling cheated, the elevator from the church to Firelink Shrine is a neat trick, but might have lost its novelty if repeated for every late game boss, and to ensure that the conclusion of each endgame gauntlet would not be followed by a monotonous walk back to Firelink Shrine, we sacrifice the unbroken experience for convenience. We get warping. After acquiring the Lord Vessel, Frampt brings us to the Altar of the Kiln. Here we set the Lord Vessel down and... without the Master Key, Firelink Shrine branches off to 3 paths, and, to a first-time player, 2 are worth going. To a returning player, that 3rd path is a mighty appealing route as well. Should the player be adventurous, they can head to New Londo early, kill Ingward, go to the Darkroot Garden to kill Sif for Artorias' ring, kill the 4 kings in New Londo, and meet Kath, who will, after the bells have both rung, open Sen's Fortress and tell the players to get the Lord Vessel. And we're back. So, Dark Souls does that awesome Silent Hill 2 thing, where it branches the narrative without strictly telling the player it's doing so. And it all hinges on the moment the player puts down the Lord Vessel. This is where, having watched my Gwyn video, will come in handy. These 2 serpents present the 2 opposing sides of the ideological debate underlining the game. The entire franchise, actually. And if you think that the narrative goals in the world seem a bit artificial, know that it's like that by design. That legend Oscar talked about in the beginning, about an undead ringing the bell and having the fate of the undead revealed to them, it didn't emerge organically. Gwyn spun that before he first linked the flame. And the entire game before putting down the Lord Vessel is the player's opportunity to break away from Gwyn's machinations by exploring the other side of this debate. The entire world has been dressed up by those who want fire preserved to produce humans who will want to do just that. But if the player penetrates through the facade, a darkness is revealed. For in spite of the lies, the world's law remains unchanged. Fire is fading. It's not by nature that humans are hollowing. Hollowing is a curse which the gods placed on humans so that they could offer them the miraculous bonfires, which reverse it, for the small cost of humanity. Everything you see in this game was carefully put in there by the gods to make humans think fire was good. But if you get to Koth before laying down the Lord Vessel under Frampt's guidance, you will get to see the world for what it really is.
We are amidst strange beings in a strange land. The flow of time itself is convoluted, with heroes centuries old phasing in and out.
Stagnant, Solaire. Misfirings and localizations have you tell players that time is convoluted, but what you are supposed to say is that time is stagnant. It's like a river which has hit a wall and has begun to stack on top of and intersect itself at different points, allowing a person on day 20 to have a talk with someone on day 2. This is what allows the player to have their first meeting with Solaire on the end of the bridge, even after they came to the undead parish via the Master Key through the Valley of Drakes and already fought the gargoyles with Solaire. In the player's time, that fight was the duo's first meeting. In Solaire's time, the bridges. If you have any questions about that, just remember that this was done for the convenience of matching the player up with NPCs outside of linear continuity, and also remember that only losers ask questions about convoluted time shenanigans in stories. The stagnation of time is linked to the fading of fire. In the Dark Souls universe, time is literally light, and with the fading of fire, the continuity of time becomes a bit hectic. But this is not the only, nor the most interesting stagnation. The coming of the Age of Dark is also stagnant. Gwyn stagnated it by forcing a dependency on fire onto everyone else, and then set up a fire-linking system where human beings would be run through a gauntlet for eternity to collect powerful souls, all the while being indoctrinated into the fire-linking cult by Framt, and being made to stand the scrutiny of Gwyn's tribe in Anor Londo. They choose who gets the Lord Vessel, to the ultimate end of sacrificing themselves to prolong the Age of Fire. And the longer this system keeps going, the worse things are going to get. When I made my videos on Demon's Souls, something which struck me about that game's story was that the horror predated the twisting of the natural world. King Allant awoke the Old One because he could no longer abide by the horrors of the rotten world. In the light of that, neither end can be thought of as the good one, seeing as horrors persist in both. It was just a matter of whether the horror was permanent, or whether, like a tearing of a band-aid, it could be done over with in a comparative instance. Dark Souls shift things thematically here by reversing cause and effect. The world was not an abject, bad place prior to the shackles of hollowing, the onset of undeath, and the fire-linking system being set up. It was just not what Gwyn wanted it to be. He wanted his Age of Fire to last forever, and his fear of man and the Dark Soul, and the fate which the world's law had in store for them, caused Gwyn to lash out and impose a fiction on the world. A fiction which is swallowed up by the majority of its inhabitants and which perpetuates avoidable suffering for the sake of idolatry. For the sake of Gwyn's vanity, everything must suffer. The people in this world are not acting in harmony with the real law governing them, they are acting in service of a lie, and to this lie there is no antidote but truth. Those who try to live nobly, who try to project meaning to it all, will in the end always be depleted. Once the futility of grandeur and purpose sets in, once all will has been extinguished, a person becomes hollow. A recurring motif in From Software's games, one dating back to Kingsfield 1, is the idea of flow. The idea is that the forces of good and evil mimic the flow of water. Good things sit high on top and act downwards like the flow of a river. This river, or good force, carries the filth in its way, and its continued flow makes it a hotspot for life and all the good things life has to offer. But the flow isn't permanent. Near the end of the river, waters get still, and all those evil forces carried by the flow will pool in the stagnant water. This is where they sink, and once they reach the bottom, things begin to rot. And like evil, rot spreads upwards again. In Demon's Souls, this was most clearly seen in the Valley of Defilement. That place was where unwanted things were disposed, and making one's way to the heart of the valley, one will find Maiden Estrella, who is the most rotten thing there. Localization had many, me included, think she was a showcase of how demonhood doesn't actually denote evil, since she devoted herself to removing the suffering of the valley, but the real story is much more sinister. She wasn't curing anyone of their ailments, she was removing the souls of those in pain. The soul is the source of clarity in Demon's Souls, so Estrella wasn't removing the pain, she was removing the capacity of those in pain to comprehend and internally articulate it. and this flow towards rot theme is shown in Dark Souls as well. Undead Burg has a sewer system in the depths, and the filth carried through there is quite literally dumped into Blighttown, which has become an embodiment of filth. The Gaping Dragon is an ancient and once noble creature which has devolved due to its environment. It's eaten filth to stay alive, and its obsession with life is now embodied in its overgrown mouth. The idea of stagnant water containing rot is also seen quite literally in New Londo. Most importantly, however, the rot theme is seen in the world. Moving 2 games ahead, the entire world has begun to sink into itself because of Gwyn's stagnating it, and the mark of the undead has appeared on the sky itself. All the little horrors which spring up in response to the stagnation in these games are the world's way of making themselves known through the rotted veil Gwyn has draped over it. Rot acts from below to oppose the light from above. It's a dark force after all, and notably, every Great Souls boss is defeated after the player descends to meet them. I noted the 4 Kings of New Londo already, but the bed of chaos is also quite deep down, as is Nito, as is Seath, if you consider it from a certain perspective. Seath is first fought in a tower which might be the highest elevation in the entire game, but that fight is unwinnable. The chosen undead must descend into the crystal cave and shatter the crystal which makes him immortal. The Artorias of the Abyss expansion is another obvious example of this idea of descending to confront evil, with every bonfire being closer and closer to the origin of the Abyss. The first boss is against a miracle-imbued monster, an emissary of light before the descent, and the next is another one of Gwyn's agents, Artorias, except he's been corrupted by the Abyss. After putting him to rest, the player makes their way through Ulasil, which gets more and more corrupted and destroyed as the chosen undead nears Manus' grave. Anor Londo, the home of the gods, is a sunny place high above the world of humans, but actually it's bathed in a false light, and for the most part, the gods are not here. The only one present is fought in the lowest part of Anor Londo we can reach, though Gwyndolin is by no means the lord of the Great Souls. And Gwyn, the highest of the high, is actually fought in the deepest depth the game has to offer, the kiln of the First Flame. Every Great Souls boss, and Manus, is in the deep. This might just be a nod to From Software's dungeon crawler origins. It might be nothing more than a coincidence spawned by the need to have long levels ahead of each boss. It might be nothing. But every one of the Lord Souls bosses spawns a bonfire when killed, and all except Seath and Gwyn are located in an area which physically cannot be exited except by warping from it. So, I wonder if the team sacrificed the interconnected world for the late game because they wanted to hammer home how each late game boss was a descent, how each one inhabited a deep. I might be stretching here, and I'll note that bosses like the Gaping Dragon, Moonlight Butterfly, and Sif, just to name a few, are also located in dead ends but are usually fought prior to getting the war. But things like Blighttown and New Londo are so on the nose that the theme being resonant in other areas, in more subtle ways, seems not only feasible to me, but likely. Things which long reside in stagnation rot, and in the heart of the rot in Lordran we find Gwyn's remains, the long, burning body of a god, which is the final trial the chosen undead must face before making Gwyn's orchestrations become a prophecy made true. After claiming the kiln, the player can do as Gwyn wanted and sacrifice themselves to keep it lit, and keep the stagnation going for longer. Or they can turn their back on the fire, reject the conditioning of Gwyn and the game, and embrace the truth that bonfires are bad. Reject fire and re-embrace the natural law. Fear not the dark, my friend, and let the feast begin. After all, It's only human. I'm still operating this channel on the bi-monthly release schedule, where every month I swap between making some videos for you guys and making my game. I spent last month overhauling Snail into a more proper game with some of the new gameplay features I've put together, and I'll hopefully be releasing a retail version of that game in the next month. I was going to have an Armored Core video ready for this month, but I've been very sick and have spent all of my free time in bed trying to recover. So in September, I'll have a real video production schedule again, and I'll hopefully be able to churn out the Armored Core videos, along with some other things, possibly. If you're new to the channel and you enjoyed this video, I'd recommend checking out some of the other things on offer here, like the Bloodborne commentary or the Sekiro commentary. There's also the aforementioned Kingsfield and Demon Souls videos. I've explored Shadow Tower and a whole heap of other titles. Links to more videos are in the description box below. Down there you can also follow up on the campaign I talked about earlier, the Abyssal Archive. I imagine if you made it to this part of the video that the Abyssal Archive should be right up your alley. To stay updated on future videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon while you're at it. You can support videos like this one by joining the channel Patreon at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. Also linked below. I'm AesirAesthetics. See you in the next video.